meter in amazement. It was incredible, even after they had seen those heptagons in action, that at such extreme range any offensive beam could be driven with such unthinkable power. Power requiring for its neutralization almost the full output of the prodigious batteries of the accumulators carried by the Sirius. Yet for 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes, that beam drove furiously against their straining screens, and even Brandon's face grew tense and hard as that frightful attack continued. At the end of 22 minutes, however, the pointer of the meter snapped back to the pin, and every man there breathed an explosive sigh of relief. The almost unbearable bombardment was over. The screen was drawing only its maintenance load. "Wow!" Brandon shouted. "I thought for a minute they were going to hang to us until we cracked, even if it meant that they'd have to freeze to death out there themselves." "It would have meant that too, don't you think?" asked Stevens. "I imagine so. Don't see how they could possibly have enough power to get back to Jupiter if they shine that thing on us much longer. Of course, the more power they waste on us, the quicker we can take them. But I don't want much more of that beam. I'll tell the world, I just about had heart failure before they cut off." The massive heptagon was now drifting back toward Jupiter at constant velocity. The Hexans were apparently hoarding jealously their remaining power, for their wall screens did not flash on at the touch of the visiray. Through unresisting metal the probing terrestrial beam sped, and the scientists studied minutely every detail of the Vorkulian armament, while the regular observers began to make a detailed photographic survey of every room and compartment of the great fortress. Much of the instrumentation and machinery was familiar, but some of it was so strange that study was useless. Days of personal inspection and experiment, perhaps complete dismantling, would be necessary to reveal the secrets hidden within those peculiar mechanisms. "They're trying to save all the power they can. Think I'll make them spend some more," Brandon remarked, and directed against the heptagon a heavy destructive beam. "We don't want them to get back to Jupiter until after we've boarded them and found out everything we want to know. Come here, Quince. What do you make of this?" Both men stared at the heptagon, frankly puzzled. For the screens of the strange vessel did not radiate, nor did the material of the walls yield under the terrible force of the beam. The destructive ray simply struck that dull green surface and vanished, disappeared without a trace, as a tiny stream of water disappears into a partially soaked sponge. "Do you know what you are doing?" asked Westfall, after a few minutes' thought. "I believe that you are charging their accumulators at a rate of—" he glanced at a meter, "exactly 31,500 kilofrancs." "Great cat!" Brandon's hand flashed to a switch and the beam expired. "But they can't just simply grab it and store it, Quince. It's impossible." "The word impossible in that connection, coming from you, has a queer sound," Westfall said pointedly, and Brandon actually blushed. "That's right, too. We have got pretty much the same idea in our cosmic intake fields. But we didn't carry things half as far as they have done. Huh, they're flashing us again. But those thin little beams don't mean anything. They're just trying to make us feed them some more, I guess. But we've got to hold them back some way. Wonder if they can absorb a tractor field." The Hexans had lashed out a few times with their lighter weapons, but, finding the Sirius unresponsive, had soon shut them off and were stolidly plunging along toward Jupiter. Brandon flung out a tractor rod and threw the mass of his cruiser upon it as it locked into those sullen green walls. But as soon as the enemy felt its drag, their screens flared white, and the massive terrestrial spaceship quivered in every member as that terrific cable of force was snapped. "They apparently cannot store up the energy of a tractor," commented Westfall. "But you will observe that they have no difficulty in radiating when they care to." "Those two ideas didn't pan out so heavy. There's lots of things not tried yet, though. Our next bet is to get around in front of them and push back. If they wiggle away from more than 50% of a pressor, they're really good." The pilot maneuvered the Sirius into line, directly between Jupiter and the Pentagon, and as the driving projectors went into section, Brandon drove a mighty pressor field along their axis, squarely into the center of mass of the Vorkulian fortress. For a moment it held solidly. Then, as the screens of the enemy went into action, it rebounded and glanced off in sparkling, cascading torrents. But the Hexans, with all their twisting and turning, could not present to that prodigious beam of force any angle sufficiently obtuse to rob it of half its power, and the driving projectors of the Pentagon again burst into activity as the backward-pushing mass of the Sirius made itself felt. In a short time, however, the wall screens were again cut off. Apparently, more power was required to drive them than they were able to deflect. Although even the enormous tonnage of the terrestrial cruiser was insignificant in comparison with the veritable mountain of metal to which she was opposed, so that the fiercest thrust of her driving projectors did not greatly affect the monster's progress, yet Brandon and his cohorts were well content. "It's a long trip back to where they came from, and since they wanted to drift all the way, I think they'll be out of power before they get there," Brandon summed up the situation. "We aren't losing any power either, since we're using only a part of our cosmic intake." In a few hours the struggle had settled down to a routine matter, the Sirius being pushed backwards steadily against the full drive of her every projector, contesting stubbornly every mile of space traversed. Assured that the regular pilots and lookouts were fully capable of handling the vessel, the scientists were about to resume their interrupted tasks when one of the photographers called them over to look at something he had discovered in one of the lowermost and smallest compartments of the heptagon. All crowded around the screens and saw pictured there the winged, snake-like form of one of the original crew of the Vorkulian vessel. "Dead?" Brandon asked. "Not yet," replied the photographer. "He is twitching a little once in a while, but you see, he's pretty badly cut up." "I see he is. He must have a lot of vitality to have lasted this long. Maybe he'll live through it yet. Hold him on the plate and get his exact measurements." He turned to the communicator. "Dr. von Stiefel, can you come down to the control room a minute? We may want you to operate upon one of these South Jovians after a while."
"Himmel, es ist der—"
The great surgeon, bearded and massive, stared into the plate, and in his surprise started to speak in his native German. He paused, his long powerful fingers tracing the likeness of the Vorkul upon the plate, then went on.
"I would like very much to operate, but not understanding our intentions, he would, of course, struggle. And when that body struggles, Schrecklichkeit!"
And he waved his arms in a pantomime of wholesale destruction. "I thought of that. That's why I'm talking to you now instead of when we get to him, 2 or 3 days from now. We'll give you his exact measurements, and a crew of mechanics will, under your direction, sink holes in the steel floor and install steel bands heavy enough to hold him rigid, from tail fins to wingtips. We'll hold him there until we can make him understand that we're friends. It is of the utmost importance to save that creature's life if possible, because we do not want one of their fortresses launched against us, and in any event it will not do us any harm to have a friend in the city of the South."
"Right. I will also have prepared some kind of a spacesuit in which he can be brought from his vessel to ours."
And the surgeon took the measurements and went to see that the operating table and suit were made ready for Cremodior, the sorely wounded Vorkul. It was not long until the projectors of the heptagon went out and she lay inert in space, power completely exhausted. Knowing that the screens of the enemy would absorb any ordinary ray, the scientists had calculated the most condensed beam they could possibly project, a beam which, their figures showed, should be able to puncture those screens by sheer mass action, puncture them practically instantaneously, before the absorbers could react. To that end, they had arranged their circuits to hurl 765,000 kilofrancs, The entire power of their massed accumulation